The bank manager didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The way she closed the folder slow, deliberate was enough to make my chest tighten. "Sir," she said quietly, her eyes steady on mine, "you might want to sit down." The strange part was, I already was. But in that moment, it felt like the ground beneath me had shifted, like something I couldn't yet see had just cracked open. Just hours earlier, my life had been painfully ordinary. My name is Ethan Harlow. I'm 46 years old, and I fix heating and cooling systems for a living. It's honest work, loud, dirty, predictable, the kind of life where problems are mechanical, solvable. Until the week my father died, the hardest thing I was dealing with was finding a replacement part for an old unit no one makes anymore. My father, Frank Harlow, passed away at 74. He was a quiet man, disciplined, the kind who believed that if something was broken, you fixed it instead of complaining about it. He lived simply, almost invisibly, saving where he could, never drawing attention to himself. At his funeral, people described him as steady, reliable words that sounded too small for a man who had quietly carried so much weight. After the service, I returned to his house, the one I grew up in, now filled with that hollow silence that only follows loss, while my wife Nicole moved through the rooms talking about what to sell and what to throw away. I found myself drawn to the garage, my father's real domain. That's where everything still felt like him. It didn't take long before I remembered something he'd told me months earlier, almost casually. "If anything happens to me, check the red box." At the time, I assumed he meant paperwork, insurance, documents, the usual. But standing there in the dim light, surrounded by tools worn smooth from decades of use, the memory hit differently. I pulled the dented red toolbox from beneath the workbench and opened it. Inside were exactly what you'd expect: wrenches, sockets, a tape measure. Nothing unusual, nothing valuable. But tucked beneath a folded rag was something that didn't belong. A small, leather-bound passbook, its edges cracked with age. I almost dismissed it. Nicole certainly did. The moment she saw it, she barely glanced before tossing it into the trash with a quiet laugh. "That's useless," she said. "Old accounts like that don't even exist anymore." And maybe she was right. Maybe it was nothing, but something about the way she threw it away too fast, too certain, stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. My father's voice kept echoing in my head, calm and precise. "Measure twice, cut once." At 5 a.m., I got out of bed, walked into the kitchen, and pulled the passbook out of the trash. That was when I noticed the folded slip of paper hidden inside. 6 words, written in my father's careful block handwriting. Asterisk, don't ask your wife. Go to the bank. Asterisk. 2 hours later, I was standing at the counter of a small-town bank, sliding the passbook across to a teller who looked at it with polite indifference at first. Then her expression changed. Minutes passed. A manager was called. And eventually, I found myself sitting in that quiet office, staring at a number written on a piece of paper that didn't make sense. Nearly $2 million. My father, the man who reused envelopes and wore the same coat every winter, had left behind a hidden account worth almost $2 million. In that moment, nothing about my life felt ordinary anymore. The number alone should have been enough to overwhelm me, but it wasn't. What unsettled me more was the silence that followed after the bank manager slid the paper across the desk. She didn't rush to explain, didn't offer reassurance. Instead, she studied me carefully, as if measuring how much I could handle before everything changed. "There's something else you need to know," she said finally, her tone even but firm. My fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "This account was flagged several years ago." The word "times flagged," times echoed in my head, heavy and unclear. "Flagged for what?" I asked. She hesitated just long enough to make my stomach drop. "An attempted access request," she said, "using power of attorney documentation that didn't pass verification." At first, the words didn't fully register. Attempted access, power of attorney. It all sounded procedural, distant until she turned the monitor slightly toward me. Lines of data filled the screen, dates, timestamps, scanned documents. Then she pointed to a name attached to the request. My name wasn't there. Neither was my father's. It was my wife's, Nicole Harlow. For a moment, I genuinely thought there had been a mistake. "That can't be right," I said quickly, almost instinctively. There must be another Nicole Harlow. But even as I said it, I knew how unlikely that sounded. The manager didn't argue. She simply tapped the file again. The identification matched your family records, she said. The documents appeared legitimate at first glance, but our system flagged inconsistencies in the signature. The transfer was denied, and the account was locked for review. My throat felt dry. When was this? I asked. 2016, she replied. 2016. I tried to place it. That was around the time my father's health had started to decline. Nothing dramatic, just small things. Forgetting appointments, mixing up dates. Nicole had stepped in more during that period. She insisted on helping with bills, organizing paperwork, answering his phone when I couldn't be there. At the time, I had been grateful. It felt like she was holding things together when I couldn't. Now, sitting in that quiet office, those same memories shifted into something else, something harder to look at. The manager continued speaking, but her voice seemed distant, like it was coming from the other side of a wall. After the failed attempt, there were no further access requests. Whoever submitted the documents didn't try again. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt calculated, like someone had tested the system once, realized the risk, and decided to wait. My mind began replaying small, seemingly insignificant moments. Nicole asking casual questions about my father's finances. Her quick dismissal of the passbook that morning, the way she had thrown it away without a second thought. As I left the office, the air outside felt sharper, colder than it had that morning. I sat in my truck for several minutes, staring at the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed in my pocket, breaking the silence. Nicole. I let it ring once, twice, before answering. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice as neutral as I could. "Where are you?" she asked. Her tone was calm, almost too calm. Not worried, not curious, controlled. "Just running an errand," I replied. A brief pause followed, short, but noticeable. "You didn't take anything else from your dad's house, did you?" she asked. "Important documents or anything like that?" The question landed harder than it should have. I glanced at the passbook sitting on the passenger seat beside me. "No," I said. "Just some old manuals from the garage." Another pause, even shorter this time. Then a soft exhale. "Okay," she said. "Just checking. Derek mentioned we should keep everything together until we sort out the estate." Derek, her brother. The name slipped into the conversation too easily, like it had been waiting there. When the call ended, I didn't start the engine right away. Instead, I sat there, listening to the faint ticking sound of metal cooling under the hood. Something didn't fit. Not the account. Not the attempted access. Not the way Nicole had asked that question. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was enough to shift something inside me. Doubt doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, piece by piece, until you can't ignore the pattern anymore. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't just dealing with an unexpected inheritance. I was standing at the edge of something far more complicated, something that had been unfolding for years, right in front of me, without me ever seeing it. The drive home felt longer than it should have, not because of the distance, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying what I had just learned. 2016. Nicole's name. A failed attempt that didn't happen again, but that didn't mean it had ended. It meant it had changed. By the time I pulled into the driveway, the house looked exactly the same as it always had, but something about it felt different, like I was stepping into a place where I no longer understood the rules. Nicole was in the kitchen when I walked in, scrolling through her phone with a cup of coffee resting untouched beside her. She looked up and smiled, normal, effortless, familiar. "How was your morning?" she asked. I studied her face for a second longer than usual before answering. "Fine," I said. "Nothing special." The lie came easier than I expected. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the timeline. If Nicole had tried to access the account in 2016, that meant she knew something back then, something I didn't. And if she knew, there was only one way she could have known. She had been involved in my father's finances far more deeply than she ever admitted. At the time, I had trusted her completely. She handled paperwork, paid bills, organized everything when my father started slowing down. I told myself she was helping. But now, that version of events felt too simple, too clean. The next morning my phone rang just as I was leaving for work. Derek. I hadn't spoken to him in weeks, maybe longer. He wasn't the kind of person who called without a reason. "Ethan," he said, his voice smooth, almost rehearsed. "Just wanted to check in. Make sure you're holding up okay after everything." I leaned against my truck, watching the quiet street in front of me. "I'm fine," I said. "Just taking things one step at a time." He chuckled softly. "That's good. Listen, I was talking to Nicole last night. We were thinking it might be easier if I helped handle some of the estate stuff. Banks, accounts, paperwork, that kind of thing can get messy fast." There it was, subtle, but not subtle enough. "I appreciate it," I replied carefully, "but I think I can manage." A brief silence followed, just long enough to feel intentional. "Of course," he said, his tone still friendly, but tighter now. "Just offering. Your dad kept things pretty simple anyway. Not much to sort through." I stared at the ground, the words settling in my chest. Not much to sort through. Nearly $2 million hidden in a bank account said otherwise. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Simple." After the call ended, I sat in my truck a little longer than necessary. 2 conversations, both circling the same idea. Don't look too closely. Don't ask questions. Let someone else handle it. The pattern was starting to take shape, and once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. Later that day, I returned to the bank not to confront anyone, but to understand more. The manager recognized me immediately and led me back into her office without hesitation. This time, the conversation was different, more direct, more detailed. She explained that while the 2016 attempt had been the only direct times access request, it wasn't the only irregularity connected to my father's finances. "We don't have full visibility into external accounts," she said, "but based on what we've reviewed, there are indicators of structured transfers, money moving in ways designed to avoid attention." My chest tightened. "What kind of transfers?" I asked. She slid a document across the desk. "Smaller amounts," she said. "Consistent. Spread out over time. That's usually how these things work when someone is trying not to trigger alerts." The realization didn't hit all at once. It came in pieces, each one harder to ignore than the last. Nicole's increasing involvement in my father's finances. Derek's sudden interest in handling the estate. The failed attempt in 2016. And now, evidence that money may have been leaving in smaller amounts. Quietly, over years. This wasn't a single mistake or a misunderstanding. It was a pattern, a system. "Do you know where the money went?" I asked. The manager hesitated before answering. "Not definitively," she said, "but there are connections to a business entity that appears in multiple transaction paths." She tapped the paper lightly. A name was printed near the bottom. Vaughn Consulting LLC, Derek's company. For a moment, the room felt too small, the air too thin. I leaned back in the chair, staring at the name as if it might change if I looked at it long enough. It didn't. Everything was starting to connect in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Nicole hadn't acted alone. Derek hadn't just been offering help out of convenience. This had been coordinated, planned over time, careful enough to avoid detection, quiet enough to keep me in the dark. As I left the bank for the second time, the weight of it all settled in fully. This wasn't just about a hidden inheritance anymore. It was about something that had been happening for years, right under my nose. Every conversation, every small decision, every moment I had trusted without question, it all felt different now, like pieces of a puzzle I had never realized I was part of. And the most unsettling part wasn't just the money. It was the realization that the people closest to me might have been building this entire scheme slowly, patiently, while I stood there believing everything was exactly as it seemed. That night, I didn't go home right away. Instead, I found myself driving back to my father's house, the place that suddenly felt less like a memory and more like a map I had failed to read correctly the first time. The garage light still worked the way it always had, flickering once before settling into a dim, steady glow. Everything was exactly where he left it. The pegboards lined with tools, the jars of screws sorted with quiet precision, the worn workbench marked by years of careful use. For most of my life, I had thought of this space as simple, practical. Now I understood it was something else entirely. It was deliberate. I walked straight to the red toolbox again, the same one he had told me to check. Earlier, I had only looked for something obvious: documents, instructions, anything that explained the passbook. But now I knew better. My father wasn't a man who left things out in the open. He believed in layers, in preparation. Measure twice, cut once. It wasn't just about work. It was about timing, about knowing when to act and when to wait. This time, I emptied the box completely, placing each tool carefully on the bench. Beneath the bottom tray, hidden under a thin, false lining I hadn't noticed before, my fingers caught the edge of something flat. I lifted it slowly. A sealed envelope. My name written across the front in my father's precise, unmistakable handwriting. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside were copies of documents, bank statements, notes, and something else that made my hands still. Side-by-side comparisons of signatures. On one side, my father's real signature, uneven, slightly shaky with age. On the other, a version that looked too perfect, too consistent. Forged. There were handwritten notes in the margins, short and direct, just like him, asterisk, signature mismatch. Transfer unauthorized. Confronted, denied. Asterisk. Each line felt like a quiet record of something he had been forced to face alone. I sat down on the stool without realizing it, the weight of it settling in slowly. He had known. Not suspected. Not guessed. Known. The next morning, I followed another thread he had left behind, one I hadn't even realized was there until now. At the bottom of one page was a name written in small, careful letters: Harold Klein. I found the office just outside of town, tucked between two older buildings that looked like they had been standing longer than most people remembered. Inside, everything felt unchanged by time: dark wood shelves, stacks of paper, the quiet hum of a place built on patience. Harold Klein himself looked exactly how I imagined he would. Older, deliberate in his movements, with the kind of presence that didn't need to announce itself. When I introduced myself, he didn't seem surprised. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said, as if this moment had been scheduled long before I arrived. He reached into his desk and pulled out a thick folder, setting it down between us with a quiet finality. "Your father asked me to give you this," he said, "but only if you followed his instructions. Only if you went to the bank." Inside the folder was everything my father had been building over the years: detailed records, timelines, copies of transactions he had flagged as suspicious. Each page was organized, precise, undeniable. It wasn't the work of someone confused or uncertain. It was the work of someone methodical, someone who understood he might not be believed while he was still alive. "He came to me in 2017, Harold said quietly. He believed he was being taken advantage of. Financially, he had proof, but he didn't have control. The power of attorney had already shifted too much authority away from him." I felt something tighten in my chest. "Why didn't he go to the police?" I asked. Harold sighed, leaning back slightly in his chair. "He tried, in his own way. But once someone is labeled as forgetful, as confused, it becomes very easy to dismiss them, especially when the person speaking for them appears organized, helpful, reliable. He didn't need to say her name. I already knew." At the bottom of the folder was a single page, separate from the rest. A notarized statement in my father's handwriting. Asterisk. "I am of sound mind. I know what is happening. I am documenting this because I may not be able to stop it myself." Asterisk. The words hit harder than anything else. Not because of what they said, but because of what they meant. He had understood his limits. He had known he might lose control of the situation while he was still alive. So instead of fighting a battle he couldn't win, he prepared for one he could. "The account you found," Harold continued, "that was his safeguard. He moved what he could before things escalated, hid it behind something no one would pay attention to. And he trusted you to follow through." I stared down at the pages, at the careful handwriting that suddenly felt heavier than anything I had ever held. This wasn't just evidence. It was intention. Every step measured, every detail accounted for. When I left the office, the world outside felt different, not louder or brighter, just clearer. For the first time, I understood what my father had really been doing all those years. He hadn't been passive. He hadn't been unaware. He had been patient. He had seen what was happening, accepted what he couldn't change in the moment, and built something that would outlast it. Not just money, Not just documents, but truth. And now, whether I was ready or not, he had placed that truth in my hands and trusted me to finish what he had started. I didn't have much time to sit with what I'd learned before things started moving in a direction I couldn't control. The call came the next morning while I was still going through my father's documents for the second time, trying to make sense of the patterns he had already laid out so clearly. "Mr. Harlow?" a calm voice said on the other end. "This is Detective Mariah Benton, Financial Crimes Division." The words alone were enough to shift the air in the room. This wasn't just suspicion anymore. It had crossed into something official. We agreed to meet at the bank later that day. When I arrived, the same quiet office felt different, less like a place of discovery, and more like a place where things were about to be defined. Detective Benton was already there. She wasn't what I expected. No sharp edges, no aggressive tone. Just a steady presence, observant, composed. The kind of person who didn't need to raise her voice to be taken seriously. She shook my hand once, firm but brief, then sat across from me, with a small notebook resting on the table. "I want to be clear," she said at the start, her voice measured. "You're not in any trouble. Right now, we're trying to understand what happened." I nodded, though my chest felt tight. "Based on the information provided by the bank and the documents your father left behind, we have reason to open an investigation into potential elder financial exploitation." The phrase sounded clinical, almost distant, but the weight of it landed hard. Family was implied without being said. She explained it carefully, as if she had done this many times before. Elder financial exploitation wasn't usually dramatic. It didn't start with large sums or obvious theft. It started with access. Trust. A shift in control that often looked harmless at first. Help with bills, managing accounts, organizing paperwork. "Most victims don't realize what's happening right away," she said. "And when they do, it's often too late or they're not believed." I thought of my father sitting alone at his kitchen table, writing notes no one else saw. The idea settled heavily in my chest. Detective Benton began asking questions, precise and deliberate. Who handled my father's finances over the past decade? Who had access to his mail, his passwords, his accounts? Had there been any sudden changes in his behavior, his confidence, his ability to make decisions? At first, my answers came slowly, but as she spoke, memories began aligning in a way they never had before. Nicole insisting she take over certain responsibilities when my father's eyesight worsened. Nicole answering his phone, speaking on his behalf. Nicole telling me he was getting forgetful, that he needed help, that it was better if she managed things for him. At the time, it all made sense. Now, it felt like something else entirely. "There's often a pattern," Benton continued, making a small note as I spoke. "Isolation, followed by control, followed by financial movement that appears justified on the surface." She paused, then looked up at me. "Your father documented quite a bit. That's unusual, but it's also very helpful." I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "He knew," I said quietly. She nodded once. "It appears he did." The conversation shifted after that, from understanding to action. "We're opening a formal investigation," she said. "That means we'll be reviewing financial records, tracking transactions, and identifying any connected parties." Connected parties. I didn't need clarification. Derek's name was already sitting in the back of my mind, waiting. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "For now," she said. "Patience." She closed her notebook gently. "And discretion. It's important that you don't confront anyone, not your wife, not her brother. If they become aware of the investigation too early, they could destroy evidence or alter records." The words were calm, but the implication was sharp. I would have to go home, sit across from Nicole, act like nothing had changed. "That's going to be difficult," I admitted. Benton's expression didn't change, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood exactly what I meant. "Most of these cases are," she said, "but the strongest ones are built quietly, carefully, just like your father did." That last part stayed with me longer than anything else. When the meeting ended, I stepped outside into the afternoon light, feeling like I was carrying something invisible but heavy. The investigation had begun. Not loudly, not dramatically, but officially. There would be no turning back from this point. What had started as a question, then a suspicion, was now a case. And the hardest part wasn't going to be uncovering the truth. It was going to be living alongside it day after day, pretending I didn't already see it taking shape. From the outside, nothing changed. That was the hardest part. I went to work, answered calls, fixed units, nodded at neighbors. Everything looked exactly the same as it always had. But underneath that routine, every moment felt different, like I was walking through my own life with a second layer running quietly beneath it. Detective Benton's words stayed with me. Asterisk patience and discretion. Asterisk. It sounded simple when she said it. In reality, it meant living each day as if I didn't already know something was wrong. Nicole didn't act differently at first, at least not in any obvious way. She still asked about my day, still talked about small things, groceries, traffic, bills, as if nothing had shifted. But once you start paying attention, you notice things you would have ignored before. The timing of her questions. The way she watched my reactions a little too closely when certain topics came up. "Did you go back to the bank?" she asked one evening casually, while drying dishes. I kept my voice steady. "No," I said. "Why would I?" She shrugged, but it felt practiced. "Just wondering." I started writing things down that same night. Not because anyone told me to, but because it felt like the only way to stay grounded. Dates, times, exact words, anything that seemed even slightly out of place. At first it felt unnecessary, almost paranoid. But after a few days, patterns began to emerge. Small ones, subtle ones. Calls that came at specific times. Conversations that circled back to the same topics: my father's house, his belongings, whether I had found anything important. Each entry on the page didn't mean much on its own. Together, they started to form something harder to ignore. Derek called more often during that time. Always friendly, always casual, but never without a purpose. "Just checking in," he would say. "Making sure you're not overwhelmed." But there was always something underneath the words, a quiet push, a suggestion that I didn't need to handle things myself, that it might be easier if I stepped back and let him take care of it. I kept my responses short, neutral, non-committal. The less I said, the more I noticed how much he was trying to fill the silence. At night, the tension settled in heavier. Lying in bed next to Nicole, listening to her breathing, I found myself replaying conversations in my head, comparing what was said to what I now knew. It wasn't anger that kept me awake, it was uncertainty. Not about what had happened that was becoming clearer, but about how long it had been happening without me seeing it. The idea that something this deliberate could exist inside something as familiar as my own home was harder to process than any number on a bank statement. Every few days, Detective Benton would call with small updates. Never dramatic, never complete. "We're tracing some transactions," she said once. "There's movement through an intermediary account." Another time, "We're identifying connections between individuals and business entities." The details were limited, but the direction was clear. The case was building, piece by piece, just like my father had built his records quietly, methodically. I followed her instructions exactly. No confrontation, no sudden changes. If anything, I became more consistent, more predictable. It felt strange at first, almost like I was playing a role I didn't fully understand. But over time, I realized that consistency was its own kind of protection. The less I disrupted the routine, the less reason there was for anyone to question it. Still, the pressure didn't disappear. It built slowly, like something tightening just beneath the surface. Every conversation carried a second meaning. Every question felt like it could be testing something. But I held onto one thing: my father's way of doing things. Careful, measured, not rushing to conclusions, not acting on impulse. If he could spend years preparing for this without losing control, then I could handle a few weeks of waiting. Because that's what it came down to. Waiting. Not passively, but deliberately. Watching, listening, documenting, letting the truth reveal itself at its own pace instead of forcing it into the open too soon. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. But it was working. And for the first time, I understood that patience wasn't just about enduring something. It was about giving the truth enough space to become undeniable. The call came just after sunrise. Detective Benton didn't waste time with small talk. "It's happening today," she said. 7:00 a.m. sharp. Simultaneous warrants. For a moment, I just sat there on the edge of the bed, the words settling in slowly, like something final clicking into place. This was at the point where everything that had been quiet, controlled, and hidden was about to surface all at once. I glanced over at Nicole. She was still asleep, her breathing steady, unaware that the life she had carefully maintained was about to fracture. I left the house before anything began. Benton had told me it was better that way. "You don't need to be there," she said. "In fact, it's safer if you aren't." So I sat in my truck a few blocks away, engine off, hands resting on the steering wheel, watching the early morning light spread across the empty street. At exactly 7:00, my phone buzzed. "We're at your residence," Benton said. "Stand by." My chest tightened, every second stretching longer than it should have. I imagined the knock on the door calm, controlled, official. No shouting, no chaos, just the quiet authority of something that couldn't be talked away. Later, Benton would describe it to me in simple terms. Nicole answered the door in her robe, coffee cup still in her hand. At first, she tried to smile, the same composed expression she used in every situation she believed she could manage. But when the warrant was read fraud, forgery, elder financial exploitation, the smile disappeared. For a brief second, her face went completely blank, like something behind it had shut off. Across town, at the exact same moment, officers entered Derek's office. He was mid-conversation with clients, presenting something about long-term investments. He tried to laugh it off at first, suggesting there had been a mistake, but the tone shifted quickly when he realized no one was there to negotiate. By 8:30, both of them were in custody. I didn't feel what I expected to feel. No relief, no satisfaction. Just a heavy stillness, like the air had finally settled after something had been building for too long. That afternoon, Nicole's lawyer called. His voice was smooth, practiced, already shaping a version of events that didn't quite match reality. "Mr. Harlow," he said, "my client believes there has been a misunderstanding. These situations can escalate unnecessarily." I said nothing. He continued. "She's willing to return a portion of the funds. We can resolve this quietly." A portion. The words echoed in my head, hollow and insufficient. "My father wasn't confused," I said finally, "and there was nothing unclear about forged signatures." The line went quiet for a moment before he shifted tone, but I had already made my decision. There would be no quiet resolution. The trial began weeks later, and it unfolded in a way that felt almost unsettling in its precision. There were no dramatic outbursts, no emotional appeals that changed the course of things. Just facts, documents, timelines laid out one after another with methodical clarity. I sat in the courtroom, hands folded, watching as years of deception were reconstructed piece by piece. The prosecution started with the foundation how access had been established. Limited power of attorney at first, justified, reasonable. Then expanded authority, supported by documents that, at a glance, appeared legitimate. But under scrutiny, the inconsistencies became clear. Signatures that were too consistent, too steady. The bank's forensic analyst explained it in simple terms. Real handwriting carries hesitation, variation, the subtle marks of a human hand. Forgery, no matter how skilled, smooths those imperfections into something artificial. Then came the financial records, transfers broken into smaller amounts, spaced over time to avoid detection. Money routed through intermediary accounts, eventually landing in Derek's company Vaughn Consulting LLC, disguised as legitimate business transactions. Emails were read aloud in a neutral tone, but their content spoke for itself. Phrases like, "move it before he notices," and "he's not tracking things anymore," hung in the air longer than the words themselves. Detective Benton testified next, her voice steady, her delivery precise. She didn't exaggerate or speculate. She didn't need to. She explained how these cases typically unfold, how control is established, how narratives are shaped to discredit the victim, how isolation makes resistance nearly impossible. "These cases rarely begin with theft," she said. "They begin with trust." But the moment that stayed with me came when Harold Klein took the stand. He held my father's affidavit in his hands, the paper slightly worn but intact. Frank Harlow was of sound mind, he said firmly. He knew exactly what was happening to him. There was no hesitation in his voice, no uncertainty, just truth, stated plainly. Nicole sat still through most of it, her expression controlled. But there were moments, small ones, when that control slipped. Derek avoided eye contact almost entirely, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to resignation. For the first time, they weren't directing the narrative. They were inside it. When the verdict finally came, it wasn't a surprise. It felt inevitable. The judge's words were measured, deliberate, echoing the same quiet certainty that had defined the entire process. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. It was sustained deception carried out over years. Nicole was sentenced to 7 years in federal prison. Derek received 3. Restitution was ordered. Assets seized. As the gavel came down, marking the official end of it all, I didn't feel closure the way I thought I would. There was no sense of victory, just a quiet recognition that something long hidden had finally been brought into the light. Not because it was forced there, but because it had been carefully, patiently revealed exactly the way my father had intended. When the judge began to speak, the courtroom fell into a silence, so complete it almost felt staged. No one shifted in their seats. No papers rustled. It was the kind of quiet that carries weight, the kind that makes every word land harder than it normally would. The decision itself was delivered without drama, without raised voices or hesitation. This was not an error in judgment, the judge said evenly. This was a sustained and deliberate act of deception. The words didn't come as a surprise, but hearing them spoken out loud made everything final in a way nothing else had. Nicole stood still as her sentence was read: 7 years in federal prison, followed by restitution and the forfeiture of assets tied to the case. Her expression didn't change much, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Not shock, not even anger. Just the quiet realization that there was no way to talk her way out of this. Derek's sentence followed shortly after 3 years. No reductions, no leniency. The evidence had been too clear, too consistent to leave room for anything else. I sat there through it all, hands resting loosely in my lap, waiting for some kind of emotional response that never really came. No sense of victory, no relief, no satisfaction. Just a steady, grounded stillness. For so long, everything had felt uncertain, questions without answers, suspicions without proof. Now there was none of that left. The truth had been laid out, examined, and confirmed. Not loudly, not dramatically, but thoroughly. As people began to stand and file out of the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted back into something ordinary, almost routine. Conversations resumed in low voices, footsteps echoed against the floor, doors opened and closed. Life moved on, just as it always does. I remained seated for a moment longer, not because I needed more time, but because I wanted to fully register what had just happened. Justice, I realized, doesn't feel the way people expect it to. It isn't a surge of emotion or a sense of triumph. It's quieter than that, more complete. It's the absence of doubt, the closing of a door that had been left open for too long. And as I finally stood and walked out of the courtroom, I understood something my father had known all along. Justice doesn't need to be loud to be real. It just needs to be certain. 6 months after the sentencing, life didn't suddenly feel different. It felt quieter. Not empty, but settled in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The constant tension, the unanswered questions, the weight of not knowing, all of it had slowly faded into something more manageable. There were no more calls from detectives, no court dates circled on a calendar, no carefully measured conversations at home. Just space, the kind you don't notice until it's finally there. The financial side of things took time to untangle. Accounts had to be reviewed, assets traced, restitution processed through layers of paperwork that seemed endless at first. I let Harold handle most of it. My father had trusted him, and at that point, that was enough for me. When everything was finally settled, I didn't feel rich. I didn't feel like I had gained something. If anything, I felt steady for the first time in a long while. I paid off my truck, cleared the mortgage, removed the quiet, constant pressure that had always been there in the background of my life. But the most important decision came after that. I didn't want to just move on. I wanted to build something that made sense of everything that had happened. Something honest. Something useful. I found a small corner property downtown, a narrow space with large front windows and a concrete floor worn from years of use. It used to be a print shop, long closed and mostly forgotten. To most people, it didn't look like much. To me, it looked like a beginning. I turned it into a repair shop. Not just a place to fix things, but a place to teach them too. During the week, I worked on appliances people couldn't afford to replace: heaters, air units, small machines that most shops would turn away. On weekends, I opened the space to anyone who wanted to learn the basics: how to maintain what they owned, how to notice problems before they became expensive. It wasn't about making something impressive. It was about making something that lasted. On the back wall, above the main workbench, I hung my father's tape measure, the old one, worn smooth from years of use. Next to it, framed simply, were the words he had repeated my entire life. Asterisk, measure twice, cut once. Asterisk, customers asked about it sometimes. I kept the answer simple. It means take your time, I'd say. Do things right the first time. But to me, it meant more than that now. It meant patience, awareness, the understanding that the way you approach something matters just as much as the result. Some evenings, when the shop is quiet and the light comes through the windows at just the right angle, I find myself standing there for a moment longer than necessary, listening to the stillness. Not the kind that comes from emptiness, but the kind that comes from knowing things are where they're supposed to be. My father never got to see this place. He never got to see how everything he had prepared, every careful step he took, would eventually lead here. But I think he would understand it. Not because of what it is, but because of how it was built, carefully, honestly, without rushing. And in that way, even now, he's still here quietly shaping the life I chose to build from everything he left behind.